The desert wind carried the sound of suffering long before I saw her. I was riding back from the dry valley, the sun dropping behind the red cliffs, when I heard something faint, half a cry, half a whisper. My horse stopped on its own, ears twitching. Out there near a patch of mesquite, something dark lay still against the sand. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a dying coyote. But as I rode closer, I saw the outline of a girl, barely moving, her hair tangled with dust, her hands trembling weakly against the earth. She was young, maybe no more than 17, and dressed in torn buckskin. Blood had dried along her shoulder and her lips were cracked white. The sight of her made the air around me feel heavier. In those lands, during the late 1800s, no man stopped for an Apache. Folks in town said it was asking for death, but I had seen too many living things die thirsty under that sun, and something in her eyes, dark, wild, and full of defiance even in pain, kept me from riding past. I climbed down, uncorked my canteen, and knelt beside her. The moment the water touched her lips, her eyes opened wide, burning with life again. She drank greedily, coughing between gulps. I could see confusion in her gaze, as if she couldn't believe a white man would stop for her. I didn't speak. Words didn't belong out there, only mercy or cruelty, and I had already made my choice. The desert was still, except for the wind whistling through dry sage. I could hear the echo of distant gunfire, small but sharp. Maybe soldiers or bounty men chasing shadows across the canyons. Her tribe must have been caught in one of those raids. The girl tried to rise, but her wound opened again. She muttered something in Apache, words I didn't understand, but her tone was fierce, like a command. I gently pressed her back down and tore a strip from my sleeve to bandage her arm. She flinched at my touch but didn't pull away. Her breathing slowed as the color crept back to her face, and for a moment, the desert around us felt less cruel. Night fell before we reached my cabin. I carried her across the plain, her body light but burning with fever. The stars came out sharp and bright, and the coyotes howled far off. My cabin sat alone near a dry creek bed, a small shelter built from weathered pine, the kind of place no one visits unless they've run out of places to go. I laid her on my bed, covered her with my old blanket, and sat near the fire. She drifted in and out of sleep, whispering words in her language. I didn't know what they meant, but her voice had a rhythm like prayer. By morning, she was stronger. When she opened her eyes and saw me again, she didn't seem afraid anymore. She sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket tight, and studied me with a calm that made me uneasy. Then she said something clear in broken English. "You gave water." I nodded. She pointed at herself, then at me. "Now you husband?" I froze, thinking I'd misheard. But her expression didn't change. She spoke it again, firmer this time, as if announcing a truth carved in stone. I didn't know what to say. In my world, giving water to the wounded was kindness. In hers, it seemed it was marriage. For a while, I laughed it off, thinking it was her fever speaking. But the way she watched me told me otherwise. She wasn't joking, nor confused. It was law. Tribal law older than any town paper or preacher's vow. I tried explaining that I was just helping, that she was free to go once she could walk again. She listened without interrupting, but when I finished, she simply said, "Spirit sees, now joined." Then she turned her gaze toward the window, as if the desert itself would judge my answer. Over the next few days, she stayed in the cabin, quiet but observant. She moved with the careful grace of someone raised by the wild, never wasting motion, never speaking unless needed. She helped gather wood, cleaned her wounds herself, and never once asked for pity. The more I watched her, the more I felt the strangeness of our situation. A few days ago, she had been dying under the sun. Now she was here alive, claiming I was bound to her by a custom I didn't understand. Rumors spread fast in that part of the territory. By the fourth day, Old Man Jensen rode by, bringing news from town. He saw her through the window and froze. "You got an Apache woman in there?" he asked, voice sharp. I didn't answer right away. He spat on the ground. "You best send her back to where she came from, or the soldiers will come for both of you." He didn't wait for my reply before riding off. I looked at her sitting by the fire, calm as a mountain. She had heard every word but said nothing. Only her eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes, met mine for a moment before she looked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind had changed direction. It carried the smell of smoke, campfire smoke, not mine. She stood near the window, watching the horizon. When she turned to me, her face was grave. "My people come," she whispered. "They know." My pulse quickened. If her tribe found her here with me, they'd see it as an offense, maybe worse than capture itself. I asked her what would happen. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear flicker behind her calm. They kill husband who does not accept. The next morning I found her standing outside, dressed in what remained of her tribal clothing, her hair braided and tied with strips of red cloth. The early light made her skin glow like copper. She didn't say where she was going, but I could tell it was toward them. I asked her to stay until her wound healed, but she shook her head. "If I go alone," she said softly, "they think you shame me." "You die! I die!" No peace. Then she looked straight at me, her eyes holding something I couldn't name. Respect, sorrow, maybe fate. "You come. You show heart. They will see." I saddled my horse, my mind heavy with questions. How had a single act of kindness turned into this? The idea of riding into Apache land with one of their own felt like suicide, but something deeper than fear kept me from refusing. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at me in the desert, half fierce, half broken. Or maybe I just couldn't let her face it alone. As we rode out, the sun climbed high, washing the land in gold. She rode behind me in silence, her hand gripping the saddle, her heartbeat steady against my back. By noon, we reached the edge of the canyon. Below, smoke rose from scattered fires. The Apache village lay hidden among the rocks, a place few outsiders had ever seen and lived to describe. She told me to stop, then dismounted slowly. "They wait," she said, voice low. I could see figures moving among the shadows, men with bows, faces painted red and black. My throat went dry. She turned to me one last time and said, "Do not speak, only stand. They will know if your heart lies." Then she walked ahead, proud despite the wound that still marked her arm. The warriors stepped forward, silent, their eyes fixed on me. One of them spoke in their tongue, his words sharp as the wind. The girl answered, her tone rising like fire. I couldn't understand, but I could feel the weight of it, the decision that would decide whether I left that place alive. The leader stepped closer, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then at her, and back again. The silence stretched until it felt like the whole canyon was holding its breath. Finally, he pointed at me and said something short. The girl turned, her voice trembling as she translated. He says, "You gave me water. You are now one of us." The world seemed to stop. Behind her calm eyes, I saw something deeper. A bond neither of us had chosen but both now carried. The warriors stood still, their judgment passed. The wind picked up again, scattering dust between us, and I realized that the simple act of mercy had written a story neither of us could erase. The law of her people had spoken, but what that law truly meant for a man like me, and what it would cost, was something I was about to learn the hard way. The air inside that canyon felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. I could feel every eye on me, men painted for war, women watching from the shadows of their huts, children silent as stones. The Apache girl stood before them, her back straight, her face steady though her wound hadn't fully healed. I kept still, trying to remember her warning, "Don't speak, don't flinch, just stand." The leader, an older man with lines carved deep into his face, watched me for a long while before raising his hand. Then, without a word, the crowd parted. The girl motioned for me to follow. We walked through the heart of the camp. Smoke from their fires curled upward, carrying the smell of roasted corn and burning sage. The huts were built close together, their walls made of hide stretched tight over willow frames. Every step felt like crossing into another world, one that didn't belong to me. I could sense that every man here knew the stories of soldiers who'd burned their villages and the settlers who'd claimed their rivers. I was the face of that history, standing there unarmed among them, tied to one of their daughters by an act of mercy that now bound our lives together. She led me to a smaller hut at the far end, near a dry stream bed. Inside, the air was cooler. A small fire crackled in the center, its light dancing against painted symbols on the walls. She motioned for me to sit, then took a seat across from me. For a long time, she said nothing. I wanted to ask what came next, what this law of hers meant, but I waited. Finally, she spoke, her English halting but clear. "You gave water when Spirit watched. That means you carry my breath now." She touched her chest, then pointed to mine. "Same life." I didn't understand much of it, but something in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a choice either of us could undo. She looked down at her bandaged arm and said almost to herself, "My father is chief. He made law for tribe. A woman saved as woman claimed." The realization hit me hard. The man who'd looked into my eyes earlier, the one who had passed judgment, was her father, the chief himself. Later that night, I sat by the fire outside, trying to make sense of it. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the canyon, silver under the moonlight. I could hear their songs in the distance, low, haunting, rising and falling with the wind. The girl sat beside the fire across from me, watching the flames as if reading something in them. I asked her name, but she hesitated. "In your tongue it means star in dust," she said quietly. "But you can say star." Her voice was calm, almost sad. She told me she had been sent to gather herbs when soldiers attacked near the valley. She ran, but one bullet had caught her shoulder. Her people believed she had died. I realized then what her return meant to them. A daughter thought lost, returned alive, carrying with her a white stranger who had given her life. It was more than gratitude. It was a story they would remember, one that could either unite or destroy. The next morning, the chief summoned me. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He spoke through another man who translated his words. "The spirit saw your act. You shared life with one of ours. To refuse her now is to refuse the balance of the earth." I wanted to tell him I hadn't meant to start anything sacred. I only wanted to help a dying girl. But even through the translator's voice, I could feel the weight of their belief. He wasn't asking. He was declaring fate. From that day, I was no longer a guest. I was part of them, at least by their law. They gave me a place near the fires, food from their hunts, and silence where others would have given suspicion. But not everyone accepted it. I could feel it in the way some of the younger warriors looked at me. To them, I was still the enemy, the same kind of man who rode with soldiers and traders that took their lands. One night as I walked to fetch water, I caught two of them watching me, whispering in their tongue. Their eyes followed me like wolves sizing up prey. Star noticed too. She said nothing, but her eyes told me she understood the danger. She began teaching me small pieces of their language, words for fire, water, peace, and truth. It was her way of building a bridge where no other could exist. Sometimes she would laugh at my broken accent, her laughter soft but full of light. Other times she grew distant, staring at the sky as if she could hear the past calling to her. Days turned into weeks. I learned how they lived, how they gathered roots, how they hunted deer with patience that bordered on silence. I learned their songs told stories older than the mountains, and that every fire had a guardian spirit. But I also saw the fear hidden behind their pride. Soldiers had been spotted near the river again. The chief called his warriors to prepare. The camp buzzed with quiet tension, and I realized that being tied to Star might soon pull me into a war that wasn't mine. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Star came to me. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly. "They think you bring curse," she said softly. "Some men want to send you away before soldiers come." I asked her what she believed. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "You gave me life. That is not curse." Her words were simple, but her tone carried something unspoken, a fear that ran deeper than any law. Before dawn, I was awakened by the sound of drums. The chief stood before his people, calling for strength. The soldiers had been seen moving north. He ordered the camp to move deeper into the canyons. Star came to my side, helping me gather what little I had. As we packed, I noticed the way the others avoided my eyes. Even the children who used to smile now stayed behind their mothers. The march through the canyon was long and silent. The ground was rough, and the air smelled of rain that never came. I watched the warriors move like shadows through the rocks, their faces painted for battle. Every echo felt like a warning. At night, we camped beneath the cliffs, and Star told me stories of the Spirit Water, a river that once ran through their land before settlers dammed it dry. Her people believed it would return one day when the earth forgave those who took it. As she spoke, I realized her tribe's struggle wasn't just about land. It was about survival, the fight to keep their soul alive in a world that kept closing around them. And somehow, I had become part of that struggle. One night, as the moon rose high, I woke to find Star sitting alone by the fire. Her eyes reflected the flames, bright and fierce. "They say you must prove heart," she whispered. "If you stay, you must take trial." I asked what that meant, but she didn't answer directly. "They will know if your spirit lies," she said. "If it does, they will send your soul back to dust." The next morning, the warriors led me to a clearing surrounded by stone. The chief stood waiting, his face solemn. Star stood behind him, her head bowed. I could feel my heart pounding like the drums that echoed through the valley. Whatever this trial was, it would decide everything. My life, her honor, and the fragile peace between our worlds. They handed me a spear and pointed to the horizon where the cliffs met the sun. I didn't understand their words, but I understood the meaning. I was to walk into the desert alone, without water, without food, and return before the third nightfall. If I returned, they would accept me as one of them. If I didn't, my bones would feed the earth. Star stepped forward, eyes glistening, and pressed something into my hand. A small charm carved from bone, tied with a strand of her hair. "For spirit," she said softly. "So you find way back." Her voice broke slightly, but she didn't look away. I wanted to tell her I wasn't afraid, but my throat felt dry. The chief raised his hand and the drums fell silent. As I stepped out into the burning light, the canyon behind me closed in like a mouth sealing shut. I could feel the eyes of the tribe on my back, could hear the wind rising through the rocks like an ancient song. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, the truth of their law and of my own heart waited to be found. But deep down, I knew one thing. The desert doesn't give mercy twice, and the next time I found water, it might not be for saving someone else. It might be the only thing standing between me and death. The desert swallowed sound. For hours I walked under the burning sun with nothing but the weight of silence pressing against my chest. The canyon had disappeared behind me, and the horizon shimmered like molten glass. I had no water, no compass, no sign of life. Only the small bone charm star had given me tied around my wrist. The heat bent the air and blurred the line between ground and sky. Every step felt heavier, every breath sharper. Somewhere in the distance a hawk circled, waiting for weakness. I kept walking until the land began to change. The sand turned coarse, scattered with sharp rocks and dry shrubs. My boots tore open at the toes. Sweat stung my eyes and my throat burned. I tried to remember why I was out there, to prove my heart, they said, to show I wasn't a liar, a trespasser, or a curse. But as the hours dragged on, the purpose began to fade, replaced by one simple thought: survive. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the desert was quiet as bone. The cold came fast, biting at my skin. I found shelter under a jagged rock ledge and built a small fire from dried brush. The flames flickered weakly, barely enough to fight the darkness. My body ached, but my mind wouldn't rest. I thought about Star, how calm she had been when she spoke of the trial, as if she already knew I'd walk into it. Maybe she did. Maybe that was her way of trusting me, or maybe it was her way of setting me free. Sleep came in short bursts. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the camp, the chief's cold stare, the warriors' painted faces, the silent judgment of a people whose ways I barely understood, and through it all her voice echoed, soft but steady, reminding me that the desert doesn't lie. It shows a man who he truly is. By dawn, the fire had burned to ash. I followed the faint tracks of animals toward a narrow gully, hoping to find moisture. The air was thick and still, but when I pressed my hand to the soil, it felt damp. I dug with my bare hands until I found a thin trickle of muddy water. It was barely enough to fill my palm, but it kept me alive. As I drank, I heard something, a rustle among the rocks. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then came the sound of movement, careful, deliberate. I turned slowly, hand on my knife. A shadow shifted near the ridge, and then I saw him. One of the younger Apache warriors from the camp, crouched with a bow drawn. His face was painted black across the eyes. We stared at each other in silence. Then, without a word, he lowered his weapon and stepped closer. He pointed to the bone charm on my wrist, then to the horizon. "Go," he said in broken English. "No return." His meaning was clear. He wanted me gone, dead or vanished, didn't matter. I told him I couldn't leave, that the trial wasn't done. His jaw tightened. "You make her shame. You make tribe weak." His words carried bitterness and grief. I realized then that he wasn't just any warrior. He was the one who had watched me from the shadows, the one who looked at Star with something more than loyalty. Before I could answer, he vanished into the rocks, leaving behind silence and dust. The encounter shook me more than I wanted to admit. The trial wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a trap woven from belief, jealousy, and pride. If I didn't survive, they'd call it fate. If I did, someone might make sure I didn't return at all. By the second night, the air turned colder, and the stars burned brighter. I built another fire and tried to stay awake. Strange sounds echoed through the emptiness, howls, whispers carried by the wind. I thought of the stories Star had told me about the spirits that watched over travelers, how they took the form of animals to guide or punish those who entered their lands. Part of me wanted to believe I wasn't alone, that maybe one of those spirits had kept me alive this far. Back in the canyon, Star sat by her father's fire, her face pale under the glow of the flames. The chief spoke in a low tone, his words sharp and steady. "If he lives, he belongs," he said. "If he dies, the earth takes what is not meant to stay." She nodded, though her hands trembled in her lap. The young warrior, the same one who had followed me, stood nearby, silent but burning with quiet defiance. Star could feel the storm building. She knew his jealousy wasn't just about honor, it was about her. He had once been promised to her before the raid that nearly took her life, but now, by the old law, she belonged to a stranger. When the chief dismissed them, Star walked away from the fire and stared out at the dark cliffs. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke, familiar but not from their fires. Soldiers were near again, scouting through the passes. If they found the camp, no amount of tradition or spirit law would save them. But she couldn't warn her father without breaking the custom that bound her. A woman couldn't question a trial once it began. The tribe had to wait for the desert to decide. The next morning, I woke to the sound of thunder, not from the sky, but from hooves. A small herd of wild horses was crossing the plain, their movements graceful and untamed. I followed them at a distance, hoping they might lead me toward water or shelter. One of them, a chestnut mare, stopped and turned its head toward me, its eyes deep and calm. It reminded me of Star somehow, strong, watchful, free. By midday, I found a canyon split open by erosion, a narrow passage lined with cactus and rock. I climbed down to rest and noticed something strange, ashes scattered near the base of the wall. Someone had camped here recently. Among the remains, I found a piece of fabric with army insignia. My heart sank. The soldiers were closer than I thought. If they were moving through Apache territory again, it meant blood would follow. As I stood there, the ground trembled slightly. A distant boom echoed from the direction of the Apache camp. Smoke began to rise beyond the hills. My chest tightened. I didn't think, I just ran. The trial, the law, the fear, they all fell away beneath the pounding of my boots. The only thought that filled my head was Star. Back at the canyon, chaos had broken loose. Smoke filled the air, and the sound of gunfire rolled through the cliffs. The soldiers had found the camp, their rifles cracking like thunder. The Apache warriors fought back fiercely, their cries mixing with the echo of bullets. I moved through the smoke, shouting her name, but the wind swallowed my voice. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw the chief standing firm, bow in hand, arrows flying. Beside him was Star, clutching a blade, her eyes fierce with defiance. She turned as she saw me, disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "Why you come back?" she shouted. I didn't have an answer, only the truth that leaving her behind wasn't something I could live with. A bullet struck near my feet, throwing dust into my eyes. The young warrior appeared beside her, dragging her toward cover. For a brief moment our eyes met. His glare was cold as steel, but there was something else. Pain. He shouted something to her in Apache, and she froze. Then, before I could reach them, another explosion lit the sky and the rocks collapsed between us. When the dust cleared, I was alone on one side of the canyon, cut off from them. The smoke thickened and the screams faded into the distance. I could hear the sound of retreating horses, the soldiers withdrawing after their raid. The sun was setting again, painting the sky with red and gold, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any trial. I stumbled back toward the ridge, every muscle burning. The fire from the camp was spreading fast, the huts collapsing into blackened heaps. The law of the tribe, the promise of survival, the fragile bond between two broken worlds. It all hung in the balance now. Lost beneath the weight of the war neither of us had started. As the stars appeared again over the ruined canyon, I clutched the small bone charm still tied to my wrist. Its edges were warm from my skin. Somewhere out there she was alive. I had to believe that. The trial wasn't over. Not until I found her. Not until I faced whatever waited beyond the smoke. The desert was silent once more, but it felt different now. It wasn't testing me anymore. It was watching, waiting, and I knew the next time I walked across its endless face, it would demand something greater than survival. It would demand the truth. Smoke drifted across the dark sky like ghosts rising from the earth. I stood among the ashes of what had been the Apache camp, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and burned wood. The ground was scattered with broken arrows, empty cartridges and pieces of cloth fluttering in the dying wind. My throat tightened as I looked at the ruins. There were no voices now, no drums, no laughter from the children who used to chase each other between the huts. The desert had taken them again. I searched through the wreckage, calling Star's name until my voice cracked. Nothing answered except the wind. I found the chief's bow near the fire pit, snapped clean in half. My heart sank. I couldn't tell if they were taken or if they escaped deeper into the canyons. The trail was unclear, hoofprints, bloodstains, footprints leading in every direction. It was impossible to tell who belonged to which side. I knelt, pressing my hand to the earth, feeling the warmth that still lingered from the fires. Somewhere in this mess, she was out there. She had to be. The night fell hard, and I made camp on the edge of the ruins. The silence was unbearable. Every sound felt like a warning. I thought about the young warrior, the one who had hated me from the beginning. He might have survived. He might have taken her away to save her or to keep her from me. Either way, I had no choice but to find them. The law of her tribe still bound me, whether I believed in it or not. It wasn't just her father's word anymore, it was mine. I had promised her with my actions, with the water I gave, with the life I shared. At dawn, I followed the canyon north. The trail grew narrow and treacherous. The rocks glowed red in the morning light, and the sky looked bruised with storm clouds. I found small traces along the path, a scrap of woven fabric snagged on a thorn, a faint print in the mud near a spring. She had been here recently. The signs were too fresh to belong to the soldiers. I quickened my pace, heart pounding with both hope and fear. By midday, I came upon a clearing surrounded by twisted mesquite trees. There, at the far end, I saw movement, a figure kneeling beside a stream. My breath caught. It was her. Star was alive. Her clothes were torn, her arm freshly bandaged, but her posture was steady. She turned before I could speak, her eyes narrowing with shock and disbelief. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she whispered, "You should not be here." I walked closer, but she stepped back. "They will kill you if they find you," she said, her voice trembling. "You broke the law of distance. The spirits chose your fate already." I told her the camp was gone, that her father might be dead, that the soldiers would come again. Her eyes filled with pain, but she didn't cry. "He lives," she said. "Taken by men in blue coats. I saw them take him north." Her hand clenched the knife at her side. "I will bring him back." The determination in her voice was stronger than the fear. I told her I would help, but she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "You belong to no tribe now. They will not trust you. And if the soldiers see you with me, they will shoot you too." But she didn't walk away. She stood there, torn between duty and something she couldn't name. The space between us felt fragile, like the thin ice of a frozen creek ready to break under one wrong step. Before I could answer, the sound of hooves echoed through the canyon. We both ducked behind the rocks. Dust rose in the distance. 5 riders in uniform, rifles slung across their backs. They were moving slow, searching. Star's hand tightened around her knife. I pulled her down beside me. The soldiers rode closer, their laughter rough and careless. They stopped near the stream, one of them dismounting to fill his canteen. Another kicked over a pile of ashes, muttering something about savages. My blood burned. Star's eyes were locked on them, fury and grief boiling under her calm. She looked at me and whispered, "They killed my brother." Her voice broke on the last word. The soldier nearest us turned his head as if he'd heard something, but the wind covered our breathing. When they finally rode off toward the northern pass, she stood up, trembling. "Now you see why I cannot wait," she said. "They will not stop until the last of us is gone." I followed her as she moved through the canyon, tracing the soldiers' trail. The path led toward the river, where the Army's temporary camp was said to be. Along the way, she told me more about her people, how the law of water bound souls together because it was believed that sharing life in the desert was sacred. To give water was to share breath, and to share breath was to bind fate. "It was never meant to trap you," she said softly. "It was meant to honor what is given without asking." We reached a ridge overlooking the river valley by dusk. From there, we could see the army tents spread out like pale ghosts against the land. Smoke curled from their fires, and the faint sound of laughter carried through the air. Star knelt beside me, pointing toward a small wooden cage near the camp's edge. Inside, I could see movement, a figure sitting in the shadows, hands bound. It was the chief. Even from a distance, I recognized his posture, the proud set of his shoulders. Star's breath quickened. "He is alive," she whispered, "but not for long." I saw the fear behind her calm face, the weight of everything pressing on her. The army would likely move him by morning, taking him farther east for interrogation or worse. We had only one night to act. I looked at her, waiting for her plan, but she was staring at the ground, lost in thought. "I must go alone," she said at last. "If they see you, they will kill us both." I grabbed her hand before she could leave. "You won't make it far alone," I said. "You're still hurt." "Let me help." She hesitated. Her eyes softened, but the fear didn't fade. "You still don't understand," she said. "If I die, it is my spirit's choice. If you die for me, it is your curse." She pulled away, but not before I saw the tears she tried to hide. When she slipped into the darkness, I stayed behind on the ridge, watching her move like a shadow toward the camp. The moonlight glinted off her knife as she crept between the rocks. Every step she took made my chest tighten. The soldiers were awake, 2 of them pacing near the fires, rifles in hand. I knew if I waited, I might never see her again. So I followed, quietly, carefully, keeping low to the ground. Star reached the cage just as the moon disappeared behind a cloud. She crouched near the lock, whispering something in her language. The chief stirred, his voice faint. But before she could break the latch, one of the guards turned. His lantern swung toward her. She froze. I saw his mouth open to shout. Instinct took over. I threw a rock across the camp, shattering a bottle near the tents. The guard spun around, distracted. She seized the chance, cutting the ropes and pulling the chief out. But luck doesn't last long in war. The alarm sounded. Gunfire ripped through the night. I ran toward them, shouting for her to move. The chief stumbled, weakened as Star dragged him toward the river. Bullets struck the ground near my feet. I grabbed a fallen rifle from the dirt, firing back to cover their escape. The flash of light from each shot burned into my vision. I could see soldiers running from every direction, shouting orders. Star reached the riverbank, pulling her father into the reeds. She turned once, looking for me, her face pale in the moonlight. I waved for her to go, but she didn't move. She was waiting. I tried to run toward her, but a sharp pain tore through my side. I fell, gasping. The world spun. The sound of the river roared louder in my ears, drowning out the chaos. I saw her break away from the reeds, running back toward me despite her father's cries. She fell beside me, pressing her hands against the wound. "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "You cannot die here. Not for me." Her words were half prayer, half command. The soldiers' voices grew closer. I could see the reflection of their torches moving through the darkness. She looked at me once more, her eyes fierce and full of sorrow. "You gave water once," she said. "Now I give it back." She pulled the bone charm from her neck and pressed it into my palm. The air around us shimmered with smoke and light. The river whispered below, the sound deep and endless. The last thing I remember was her hand tightening around mine as the echo of gunfire rose again. The desert, the law, the bond we didn't choose, all of it was closing in, ready to decide our fate. The world drifted in and out of sound, shouting, water, the crack of rifles fading into distance. Then there was nothing, only darkness, soft and deep like the bottom of a river. When light finally returned, it came through the faint flicker of a small fire. The air was cool, filled with the smell of wet earth. I blinked and saw her, Star, kneeling beside me, her hands covered in blood and dirt, her face streaked with tears. The bone charm she had pressed into my palm hung loosely from my fingers. "You live," she whispered, voice trembling. Her hair was tangled, her arm bruised, but her eyes shone with relief. I tried to speak, but my chest ached and no sound came. She placed a hand on my shoulder, gentle yet firm. "Be still." The river carried us away from them. It took me a moment to understand. We weren't near the camp anymore. The sound of running water filled the air, steady and calm. She must have dragged me into the river to escape, letting it carry us through the canyon until the soldiers lost our trail. Hours passed before I could sit up. The pain in my side was dull but bearable. She had stitched the wound using a strip from her dress and sealed it with herbs she carried in a small pouch. Her father, she said, had escaped with help from the young warrior, the same one who had once hated me. The soldiers thought he was dead and left him behind. He had gone east to gather the few survivors scattered after the attack. For 2 days we rested near the riverbank, hidden among the rocks. I watched her move with quiet purpose, tending the fire, setting traps for fish, whispering to the wind as if speaking to unseen spirits. At night she sang softly, songs from her tribe, words I didn't understand but felt in my bones. Each note carried a sadness older than either of us, yet within it was something gentle, forgiving. I realized then that she wasn't just healing me. She was saying goodbye to everything her people had lost. When I was strong enough to walk again, we started following the river north, towards safer ground. The land changed as we moved. Greener valleys, patches of cottonwood, signs of rain returning after months of drought. Along the way, we found tracks of the survivors, small fires, carved symbols on the trees marking their direction. Her face lit up each time she saw them. She knew her people were still alive, still moving. That gave her strength, and somehow it gave me mine too. One evening, as we camped beneath a cliff, she sat beside me, quiet for a long time. The firelight flickered in her eyes. "When I was little," she said, "my father told me the desert is alive. It tests us to see what we carry inside. Those who walk it with anger are broken. Those who walk it with love find the way back. She looked at me then, her gaze deep and steady. You walked it and you found me. Now you must find yourself. Her words lingered in the night air. I didn't know what finding myself meant anymore. The man I had been, the wanderer, the loner who built a cabin to stay away from people, no longer existed. The desert had burned that part of me away. What remained was someone tied to her by something neither of us had chosen, but both had come to accept. By dawn, we reached the edge of the high plains. From there we could see smoke in the distance, not from war this time, but from cooking fires. The surviving Apache had regrouped near the foothills. When we approached, the young warrior was the first to see us. He froze, disbelief written on his face. Behind him, the chief stepped forward, leaning on a carved staff but standing tall despite his wounds. Star ran to him, falling to her knees, and he placed his hands on her head, whispering a prayer. Then his eyes turned to me. For a long moment no one spoke. The others stood still, watching. The chief's gaze softened and he raised his hand. You walked the trial, the translator said quietly. You gave life and life was given back. The spirit saw your heart, he paused. You are free. The words hit me harder than I expected. Free. The bond between us, the one written in their law, was lifted. It wasn't rejection. It was release. I looked at Star, unsure of what to say. She smiled faintly, her expression calm but unreadable. Freedom is not the end, she said softly. It is the beginning. We stayed with the tribe for a few more days. The soldiers never returned. The survivors buried their dead and began to rebuild deeper in the canyons where the rivers met. The young warrior came to me one morning and handed me a bow. His voice was quiet, his tone no longer filled with hate. You fought beside us, he said. The desert knows your name now. It was his way of forgiveness, and I accepted it in silence. On our last night there, Star and I stood by the river that had once saved us. The moon hung low, painting silver across the water. She reached for the charm still tied to my wrist. Keep it, she said. It carries both our spirits. I wanted to ask her to come with me to leave all of this behind, but the words caught in my throat. She belonged to the land, to her people, to the endless horizon that had shaped her. I understood that now. When morning came, I saddled my horse. She stood watching as I packed my things. Where will you go? She asked. I looked out toward the open plains. Maybe back to the cabin, I said. Maybe somewhere the wind doesn't remember my name. She smiled at that, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and peace. The wind remembers everything, she whispered. Even love. I rode until the camp was no longer in sight, until the sound of the river faded behind me. The land stretched wide and empty ahead, yet it didn't feel lonely anymore. Every mile carried the weight of what had been lost and the quiet strength of what had survived. The sun climbed higher, turning the plains golden. I thought of her, of the courage in her eyes, the fire in her heart, and the unspoken bond that neither time nor distance could erase. When I finally reached my cabin, the place felt different. The door creaked the same, the floor still groaned under my boots, but it wasn't just wood and dust anymore. It was memory. I built a fire and placed the bone charm above the mantel. The flames reflected off it, casting small shadows that danced across the walls. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive. As days passed, I found myself walking the land again, fixing fences, tending to the soil, listening to the wind. Sometimes, when the air grew still, I could almost hear her voice in it. Other times, I saw her face in the flicker of the fire. She had become part of the world itself, woven into its silence, its endurance, its will to heal. Months later, one evening as the sun set red over the desert, I saw a figure on the ridge. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of light, but then she lifted her hand, the same calm wave I remembered from that first day. My heart stopped. By the time I reached the ridge, she was gone, only footprints left in the sand. Yet somehow that was enough. I smiled, knowing she was alive, still watching, still carrying the same law that had bound us long ago, the law of water, of mercy, of shared breath. The desert around me was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. Every stone, every gust of wind carried a story now. And as I stood there, the stars rising above the horizon, I finally understood what her father meant when he said the earth keeps balance. To give life even once is to carry its echo forever. So I stayed there, on that stretch of land between silence and sky, knowing that some bonds don't break, they simply change shape, becoming part of the wind that moves across the desert, part of the water that saves the dying, and part of the hearts that choose compassion over fear. And in that quiet place where her memory met the horizon, I whispered the words I never got to say aloud. You gave me life too. Then I let the wind take them back to her, back to the canyon, back to where our story began.